How America built military bases around the world. Where are you watching from today? Your city and your country? Let us know in the comments. And before we begin, please subscribe, like, and share this video so this story can travel farther than the lies that buried it. Because some histories were not simply forgotten. They were hidden, rewritten, polished, handed back to the world as truth. And tonight we begin opening one of the biggest locked doors in modern history. The story of how America built military bases around the world, not in one sudden move, not in one war, not with one speech, but step by step, island by island, treaty by treaty, until the map of the earth itself began to look less like a collection of independent nations and more like a giant board marked with quiet American footprints. Some small, some massive, some obvious, and some hidden behind fences, radar domes, airstrips, listening stations, naval ports, warehouses, fuel depots, and compounds so secret that even people living nearby often did not know what happened inside them. And if that sounds like the opening of a thriller, that is because it is. Only this time, the thriller is real. And the first clue in the mystery takes us back to a time when America still claimed to be a young republic that wanted little more than peace, trade, and distance from Europe's old empires. But beneath that image, another ambition was growing, a harder ambition, a colder ambition. The belief that safety did not come from staying home. It came from reaching outward before rivals could. And by the late 19th century, that belief was no longer a whisper in private rooms. It was becoming a national mission, dressed in the language of destiny, security, and civilization. And then came the turning point, the moment that changed everything. The Spanish-American War of 1898, a war often presented as short, dramatic, and noble. But beneath the headlines and patriotic slogans, it opened a gate that would never fully close again, because when the smoke cleared, the United States did not just win a war, it gained stepping stones: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And those places were not just territories or prizes, they were positions. They were keys, they were anchors dropped into the Caribbean and the Pacific. And the men thinking in naval charts and imperial strategy saw immediately what many ordinary citizens did not. These islands could become permanent outposts, places to refuel ships, station troops, gather intelligence, and hold a military presence far from American shores. And once a nation begins to think in terms of outposts, it starts to think differently about the world. Every coastline becomes a possibility. Every harbor becomes a future bargaining chip. Every alliance becomes a door that might one day open to a base. And that is how empires often begin. Not always with a loud declaration, but with a practical question asked by men in uniform and men in government. Where can we land? Where can we stay? Where can we strike from if we need to? And behind that question stood one of the most important minds of the era, a naval thinker whose ideas spread like fire through Washington. The belief that sea power would decide the future, that whoever controlled coaling stations, ports, and strategic choke points would shape the century ahead, and suddenly islands that looked tiny on a classroom map became priceless. Guam was no longer just a distant Pacific possession. It was a pivot. Puerto Rico was no longer just a Caribbean island. It was a platform. And Cuba, though not formally annexed in the same way, quickly became tied to American military influence through arrangements that made Washington's shadow impossible to ignore. And here is where the suspense begins to deepen. Because while Americans were told stories about liberation and victory, a quieter machinery was already turning in the background. Survey teams, naval planners, diplomats, engineers, legal advisors, all moving like pieces on a board, studying where runways might go, where naval facilities could expand, where agreements could be signed, where influence could be made to look voluntary, even when it was backed by overwhelming power, and this pattern would repeat again and again over the next century, rarely announced as empire, almost always explained as necessity, and always built on one crucial principle. America would not need to rule every land directly if it could place enough steel, concrete, aircraft, and agreements across the globe to reach any crisis, any rival, any shipping lane, any rebellion, any resource route, any ocean crossing. And so what looked like scattered installations were actually the early bones of a system. And once the system started growing, it learned to feed itself. Every new foothold created the argument for another. Every new threat justified another expansion. Every new rival produced another request for access. And every war left behind a footprint that was somehow never temporary for long. But before the great explosion of bases after the Second World War, America had to pass through a dangerous age of transition. Because by the early 20th century, the country was no longer only a continental power. It was becoming an oceanic power, a power that could not think only about its own borders anymore. And this changed the military imagination completely. Defense no longer meant waiting behind the Atlantic and Pacific. It meant meeting danger far away before it ever came close. And that idea, simple on the surface, became one of the strongest justifications for building bases abroad, because if danger was always out there, then military presence also had to be out there, and suddenly distance itself became an enemy, to be defeated by ports, airfields, and forward stations. And nowhere was this more obvious than in the Pacific, where American strategists saw a vast ocean not as empty water, but as a chain of possible battle routes, supply lines, and island fortresses. And each territory became part of a larger puzzle. Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, each one a rung on a ladder stretching westward. And while civilians saw tropical landscapes and maps with soft colors, military planners saw fuel ranges, docking depths, artillery angles, and communication relays. They saw war before it arrived, and they prepared for it by building the infrastructure to survive it. But even then, something else was happening, something more unsettling. Because these bases were never just about war. They were also about leverage, and leverage is often more powerful than battle. A base can influence politics without firing a shot. It can shape local economies, bend alliances, reassure friendly governments, intimidate rivals, and quietly remind an entire region who has the ability to arrive fastest if things fall apart. And this was the genius and the danger of the American base system. In its earliest form, it was military architecture disguised as order. And over time, it would become one of the most effective tools of global influence ever built. But in the early years, the structure was still incomplete, still forming, still waiting for the great shocks that would turn scattered footholds into a near-planetary network. And that shock would come in the form of global war, not once, but twice. Because the First World War taught Washington that industrial war demanded logistics on a scale the world had never seen. And logistics always leads back to geography, to where ships stop, where troops move, where equipment is stored, where command is organized, and where reinforcements can arrive before defeat arrives first. And then between the wars, as aircraft technology improved and naval strategy evolved, the map became even more urgent because range mattered, refueling mattered, maintenance mattered, and nations began to understand that future wars would not be won only by courage or numbers. They would be won by networks, and America was slowly, steadily learning how to build one. But the true transformation, the one that would make the world look completely different, came after the attack on Pearl Harbor, because that single strike shattered any remaining illusion that oceans alone could keep America safe. And from that point forward, the logic hardened into doctrine. Never again would the United States wait behind its own shores if it could build the means to project force outward. And the Second World War became not only a military struggle, but a massive exercise in global positioning, as the United States built, seized, expanded, and operated facilities across continents and oceans at a pace never before seen, airfields on remote islands, naval stations in strategic waters, supply hubs in deserts and jungles, communication sites in isolated regions, temporary camps that would later become permanent. And by the time victory came, something extraordinary and deeply consequential had happened. America had not only helped win the war, it had learned how to place itself physically across the world and keep itself there. And that lesson would become the foundation of the modern era, because wars often end on paper long before they end in infrastructure. And once you have spent enormous treasure-building ports, barracks, roads, depots, fuel farms, hospitals, command centers, and runways in key locations, the temptation to keep them is immense, especially if a new enemy is already appearing on the horizon. And by 1945, that new enemy was already taking shape in the minds of American planners, not a defeated empire this time, but a rival ideology, a rival military bloc, a rival vision for the future. And that meant the wartime network would not be dismantled. It would be refined, expanded, justified, and frozen into something more permanent than most people yet understood. But before we reach that next stage, we have to understand the real secret of how all this worked. Because military bases are not built only with soldiers and cement. They are built with stories, and every base needs a story, a reason, a fear, a promise, a phrase that makes it sound temporary, necessary, and stabilizing. And in every era, America found those stories: anti-piracy, anti-fascism, anti-communism, regional stability, freedom of navigation, rapid response, deterrence, alliance, reassurance. And sometimes those reasons were real. Sometimes they were exaggerated. Sometimes they were both at once. But together they formed the language that made expansion acceptable, not only to the American public, but to many host governments too. Because a base rarely arrives as a naked confession of power, it arrives wrapped in mutual defense, wrapped in partnership, wrapped in urgency, and often signed quietly behind polished tables by men in suits, while ordinary citizens know little of the long consequences. And this is where our story becomes more than military history. It becomes political theater, diplomatic chess, and at times something close to a global magic trick, because bases often appear not as conquest, but as cooperation, and yet once established, they can outlive governments, ideologies, and even the crises that created them. And that is why tonight's story matters, because to understand modern American power, you cannot look only at bombs, ships, or budgets. You must look at a location, at the hidden architecture of reach, at the silent promise embedded in every runway and harbor, the promise that America can show up almost anywhere, faster than most nations can even react. And that ability was not improvised in the modern age. It was built piece by piece, beginning in the age of empire, sharpened in World War, and soon, in the chapter ahead, transformed into something far bigger, far more organized, and far more chilling. A worldwide ring of military presence designed not just to defend a nation, but to shape the planet itself. The war had ended. The guns had gone quiet in many places. Cities across Europe and Asia were trying to breathe again, and millions of people believed the world was finally stepping out of the darkness. But inside Washington, another kind of war room was already alive, colder than the battlefields and far more dangerous in the long run, because while ordinary people celebrated peace, military planners were staring at maps with a different emotion entirely: suspicion. And on those maps, they no longer saw victory as an ending, they saw it as an opening. a rare and powerful moment when the United States stood stronger than almost every other nation on Earth, with its factories intact, its navy dominant, its air power unmatched, and its troops already spread across continents. And that raised a question that would shape the modern world. Should America come home, or should it stay where the war had placed it and build something permanent from wreckage? And once that question was asked, history took a sharp and unforgettable turn, because returning home would have meant dismantling a wartime machine, reducing overseas deployments, and trusting diplomacy to manage the post-war order. But staying meant something else. It meant transforming temporary war positions into permanent, strategic footholds. And that is exactly what began to happen. First cautiously, then rapidly, and then with such force that entire regions would never again experience American military presence as a passing event, because the United States had learned a brutal lesson during the war. Distance kills, slowness kills, unpreparedness kills, and no serious planner wanted to be caught helpless again while danger gathered overseas, so the logic of wartime survival was reborn as peacetime doctrine. And with that shift, military bases stopped being emergency tools and became part of the architecture of power itself. And nowhere was this transformation clearer than in Germany and Japan. Two defeated enemies that would become two of the most important anchors of the American military world. And that is one of the great ironies of modern history. The countries once bombed, invaded, and occupied would soon host some of the most powerful American military facilities on Earth, not as punishment alone, but as pillars of a new geopolitical order. Because after 1945, the United States did not simply occupy these nations and leave, it rebuilt them, reorganized them, and positioned itself within them, not just politically and economically, but physically, through bases, command structures, troop deployments, supply chains, and strategic agreements that turned former battle zones into permanent centers of American reach. And once those foundations were laid, they proved astonishingly durable, because they served more than one purpose at the same time. They deterred enemies, reassured allies, projected influence, and gave Washington a front-row seat in two of the most important theaters on Earth, Europe and East Asia. And as the ruins of the Second World War cooled, a new fear rose fast. The Soviet Union, no longer merely an ally of convenience, but increasingly seen as a rival power with its own military strength, ideology, and ambition. And once Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe became clear, the mood inside American strategy circles hardened almost overnight. This was no longer just about rebuilding peace. This was about preparing for confrontation, and that fear changed everything. Because if the Soviet Union might push westward, then Europe needed American troops already in place, already equipped, already ready. And if communist influence might spread in Asia, then bases in Japan, Okinawa, Guam, and beyond became even more vital. And this is how the base network exploded after the war, not by random growth, but by the logic of containment, the idea that America had to surround, monitor, and if necessary, choke off rival expansion before it reached a point of no return. And once containment became the grand strategy of the age, bases became its bones, its nerves, and its hidden heartbeat. And the public language used to justify them was often noble: freedom, stability, mutual defense, peace through strength. But beneath that language was a more ruthless truth. Whoever controls the forward positions controls the tempo of history, because military presence changes the behavior of everyone around it. Allies feel safer, rivals feel watched, local governments calculate differently, trade routes become more secure, and crises that might otherwise spiral can be answered within hours rather than weeks. And Washington understood this deeply, perhaps more deeply than any power before it, which is why the post-war years saw not just a few major bases preserved, but an entire system refined into something almost mechanical. Command centers linked to airfields, airfields linked to naval ports linked to logistics hubs linked to intelligence sites, and all of it tied together by communications, treaties, planning to airfields, airfields linked to naval ports linked to logistics hubs linked to intelligence sites, and all of it tied together by communications, treaties, planning staffs, and a bureaucracy large enough to manage military presence across half the globe. And by the late 1940s, the system was no longer accidental, it was deliberate. And then came another turning point that made the expansion even more dramatic, the creation of formal alliances. Because one thing is to station forces in occupied territory after war, but another thing entirely is to lock that presence into legal and political structures that outlive the war itself. And this is where NATO changed the game. Because when the North Atlantic Alliance was formed in 1949, it did more than promise collective defense. It gave the United States a long-term framework for remaining militarily embedded in Europe without appearing to be an occupier, and that distinction mattered enormously, because an occupying army eventually invites resentment. But an allied force invited under mutual defense language can remain for generations, and that is one of the most important secrets in the story of American bases. Permanence often arrives wearing the mask of partnership, and once the alliance structure was in place, the American presence across Europe gained a new kind of legitimacy. Barracks became symbols of solidarity, air bases became shields against Soviet bombers, and troop deployments became not only military tools, but political signals, each one a message to Moscow that any attack would trigger a direct American response. And the same pattern emerged in Asia, though in a different form, because there the legacy of war, occupation, and regional instability created a different map of dependence and fear, and Japan especially became indispensable, not just because of its location, but because it sat near the fault lines of the future, close to Korea, close to China, close to the Soviet Far East, close to sea lanes that mattered enormously for trade and strategy, and so what had begun as occupation matured into a long-standing military partnership that would shape the balance of power in Asia for decades. And with each year, the infrastructure grew more sophisticated, more expensive, and more deeply rooted. Runways lengthened, ports expanded, warehouses filled, intelligence networks widened, and command systems became more integrated, and soon these bases were not simply local facilities. They were parts of a planetary machine, able to receive troops, aircraft, supplies, and orders with increasing speed. And this was where America's real advantage emerged. Not just firepower, but readiness through positioning, because a nation can own the most advanced weapons in the world. But if those weapons are too far away when the crisis begins, they lose much of their value. And America solved that problem by spreading itself outward, by placing enough steel, fuel, and personnel across the map that it could act before rivals fully understood what was happening. And that is why the post-war base build-out was not a side story. It was the story, the hidden structure that made every later intervention, every alliance promise, every show of force, and every rapid deployment possible. And yet the expansion was never as simple or clean as official history likes to suggest, because every base existed inside another nation, on another people's land, near another people's homes, under another people's sky. And that created tension from the very beginning. Some host countries welcomed the security and economic benefits. Others tolerated the presence uneasily, and many citizens carried mixed feelings: pride, dependence, resentment, fear, opportunity, humiliation, all tangled together, because military bases can bring jobs and money, but they also bring noise, accidents, legal disputes, environmental damage, cultural friction, and the permanent reminder that national sovereignty is sometimes more complicated than it looks on paper. And so beneath the grand language of alliances and stability, there was always another story running underneath, quieter, more local, more human. The story of towns that changed around barracks and airfields. The story of communities living in the shadow of a foreign military presence. The story of agreements signed far above the heads of ordinary people. And as America's global footprint hardened after the war, those tensions would only grow more important, because the larger the network became, the more it had to be managed, not just with force, but with law, diplomacy, and persuasion. And in the next chapter, that machinery will come fully into view, because bases were not simply built by winning wars. They were built through paperwork, executive deals, status agreements, and quiet negotiations that often determined more than any battlefield ever could. And once that legal and diplomatic system was perfected, the American military network would become something even more astonishing: a worldwide structure able to survive changing presidents, changing wars, changing slogans, and even changing empires while still standing exactly where it had been planted. If war built the appetite for bases, then paperwork built the empire itself, because steel and concrete alone cannot keep foreign troops on foreign soil for generations. There has to be a legal spell cast over the arrangement, a political language that turns something deeply sensitive into something publicly acceptable. And that is exactly what America learned to master after the Second World War. Not just how to win battles, but how to negotiate permanence without always calling it permanence. How to stay without always looking like it was staying forever. And this is where the story becomes even more unsettling, because many of the most important moves in the rise of the American global base network did not happen under battlefield smoke or in moments of dramatic surrender. They happened in conference rooms, embassy halls, legal offices, and closed-door meetings where maps were unfolded, clauses were debated, and signatures quietly changed the fate of entire regions. And once those signatures were placed, runways could appear, naval access could be secured, intelligence compounds could be justified, and thousands of foreign troops could live inside another sovereign country under rules that often gave them unusual protections, unusual freedoms, and unusual power. And the system did not emerge by accident. It was carefully built through bilateral agreements, executive arrangements, defense pacts, lease terms, and most importantly, what became known as Status of Forces Agreements, or SOFAs, one of the least glamorous but most powerful tools in the history of modern empire. Because if you want to understand how America remained spread across the world long after wars ended, you have to understand that a base is not only a military object, it is a legal object, a diplomatic object, and sometimes a political trap. And SOFAs were the mechanism that made the whole structure livable for Washington, because they answered explosive questions before those questions could become crises. If an American soldier committed a crime abroad, whose courts had authority if equipment moved through a host country, what customs rules applied if aircraft landed, who controlled inspections if troops needed housing, transport, communication, or supply rights, how would those be arranged? And if tensions rose between local populations and military personnel, who had the final word? And once you begin to ask those questions honestly, you realize a foreign base is not just a fenced piece of land. It is an entire legal universe sitting inside another country. And that is what makes the story so gripping, because every base is also a negotiation over sovereignty. And sovereignty is one of the most sensitive things any nation possesses. So how did America persuade so many governments to accept it? The answer is never simple, because it changed depending on time, place, fear, and opportunity. But again and again, the same ingredients appeared: security guarantees, economic aid, military assistance, political pressure, elite alignment, strategic urgency, and above all, fear of a greater enemy. And during the Cold War, that enemy was often the Soviet Union, or in Asia, communist expansion more broadly. And fear is one of the most effective diplomatic tools in history, because a government that feels vulnerable will often accept conditions in peacetime that would have seemed unthinkable in calmer years, and Washington understood this with remarkable clarity. It did not need every country to love American military presence. It only needed enough leaders to believe that hosting American forces was safer than standing alone, and once that belief took root, the door opened, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. And behind that door came not just troops, but infrastructure, fuel systems, munitions storage, communications equipment, radar installations, medical units, schools for dependents, housing blocks, maintenance depots, and all the invisible machinery that turns a military outpost into a semi-permanent world of its own. And one of the most striking truths in this story is that bases often expand far beyond the original promise used to justify them. A temporary airstrip becomes a regional hub. A logistics station becomes a command node. A support agreement becomes a long-term security dependency. And before long, what was introduced as limited access has evolved into a strategic anchor. And this process repeated itself so often across continents that it began to look less like a series of isolated arrangements and more like a refined method, a playbook. And perhaps the most brilliant part of that playbook was its flexibility, because America did not rely on one single model everywhere. It adapted. In some countries, it maintained large, visible, highly institutionalized bases. In others, it preferred smaller access agreements, rotational deployments, intelligence facilities, or dual-use infrastructure that could support military operations without always carrying the same political weight as a giant traditional base. And this made the network harder to challenge and easier to preserve, because even when public opposition grew in one form, the presence could often continue in another, renamed, resized, reclassified, but still strategically useful. And this is where the suspense in our story deepens further, because many citizens around the world did not fully grasp how much had been agreed in their name until the structures were already there, until the convoys rolled through, until the aircraft thundered overhead, until the fences went up, until the legal protections were tested in controversial cases. And by then, the issue was no longer theoretical. It was embedded in daily life. And nowhere did this become more emotionally charged than in places where American troops remained for decades, because time changes the meaning of presence. What begins as emergency cooperation can, over generations, start to feel like a parallel order inside national space. And that tension produced some of the most difficult political questions of the modern era, questions host governments often struggle to answer honestly. How much sovereignty had been traded for security? How much dependence had been normalized? And how much leverage had quietly shifted toward Washington? Because a host nation may formally consent to a base, but consent in international politics is rarely as pure as it sounds. It can be shaped by aid, by debt, by alliance expectations, by regional threats, by elite interests, and by the fear of what might happen if support is withdrawn. And this does not mean every agreement was coerced or dishonest. Many were entered willingly and even enthusiastically. But it does mean that the official story of mutual partnership often leaves out the harder reality. Power is never equal at the negotiating table. When one side arrives with aircraft carriers, nuclear guarantees, intelligence reach, and the ability to shape a region's military future. And so the paperwork that sustained America's base network was often less like a simple contract and more like a carefully managed balance of pressure, reassurance, and strategic calculation. And once signed, these agreements did more than authorize military presence. They created habits of dependence, and habits can be harder to undo than fear itself because over time, host militaries train with American forces, political leaders plan around American backing, economies adapt to the spending associated with bases, and security establishments begin to think with Washington rather than merely alongside it. And when that happens, the base is no longer just a facility, it is part of the host country's strategic bloodstream, and removing it becomes politically, economically, and psychologically difficult. And this is one of the great reasons the American military footprint proved so resilient. It was not held together only by weapons. It was held together by systems, agreements, routines, and expectations that made withdrawal feel risky even when public anger grew, and public anger did grow, because the presence of foreign troops always carries the possibility of friction. And some of the most politically explosive moments in host countries came not from enemy attack, but from incidents involving soldiers, aircraft crashes, crimes, jurisdiction disputes, land seizures, and environmental concerns, and every such event forced governments to confront an awkward truth. Military alliances may be signed at the highest level, but they are lived at ground level by ordinary people. And ordinary people often ask blunt questions that diplomats prefer to avoid. Why are they still here? Who gave them these rights? Who answers when something goes wrong, and who truly benefits from this arrangement? And those questions became especially powerful in places like Japan, South Korea, Italy, Germany, and elsewhere, where generations grew up with American military presence as a normal but contested part of life. And yet, despite protests, renegotiations, and periodic political storms, the network endured because Washington had become extraordinarily skilled at defending not only the military value of its bases, but the legal and diplomatic framework that kept them alive. And by the time the Cold War matured into a global struggle, the United States was no longer improvising its overseas presence. It had institutionalized it, professionalized it, and woven it into the very structure of its foreign policy. And that meant the base network could survive elections, scandals, regional upheavals, and even changes in military technology because it was backed by something stronger than hardware alone. It was backed by doctrine, bureaucracy, law, and alliance culture. And that combination made it one of the most durable systems of global power ever assembled. But durability did not mean peace of mind because, as the next chapter will reveal, once the legal and diplomatic machine was in place, America used it to build something far more ambitious than scattered outposts or defensive alliances. It used it to surround its enemies, watch entire regions, and prepare for wars that might begin anywhere, at any hour, under any sky. And from that moment on, the world was no longer just divided by ideology. It was ringed by bases. Once the legal doors had been opened and the diplomatic signatures had dried, America moved into the next and far more dangerous stage of its rise, not simply placing bases where war had already happened, but building a military ring around the world to prepare for wars that had not yet begun. And this was the true Cold War transformation, the moment when the base network stopped looking like the leftovers of past conflict and started looking like a deliberate system of global encirclement, because Washington no longer thought only in terms of defending one nation. It thought in terms of containing entire rival powers, and that meant surrounding them with listening posts, air bases, naval stations, supply depots, radar sites, and rapid response hubs that could watch, warn, threaten, and if necessary strike, often with terrifying speed. And at the center of this strategy was one cold belief: whoever controls the outer ring can shape the inner fear. And so, from Europe to East Asia, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, America helped build a chain of military presence that was designed not only to defend allies, but to trap adversaries inside a tightening circle of pressure. And for the Soviet Union, this meant facing American power across Western Europe, Turkey, the North Atlantic, and key maritime routes, while for Communist China it meant watching American strength harden through Japan, Okinawa, South Korea, Guam, and the broader Pacific. And every new tension, every border crisis, every revolution, every coup, every missile test, every ideological shift became another argument for why the ring had to grow stronger, wider, and more permanent. And what made this system so effective was that it did not rely on one giant fortress. It relied on layers, dozens of sites, each one with a purpose, some visible and symbolic, others hidden and technical, some built to host thousands of troops, others designed to detect, relay, refuel, or quietly support operations far from public attention. And together they formed a military web so extensive that in many regions America no longer needed to rush in from across the ocean. It was already there, waiting. And that waiting changed everything. Because a power that is already in position can move faster than a rival that still has to decide whether to act, and speed in war, speed in crisis, and speed in diplomacy often decides outcomes before the public even understands what is happening. And this is why the Cold War base system was so central to American strategy. It made reaction feel almost instantaneous, and in doing so, it gave Washington an enormous advantage in deterrence, surveillance, and political influence, because even when no shots were fired, the mere fact of presence shaped decisions. Allies felt less alone, rivals felt less free, and unstable governments knew that American force was never too far away. And perhaps nowhere was this more dramatic than in Korea, where war in the early 1950s transformed the peninsula into one of the most heavily militarized fault lines on Earth. And from that point onward, South Korea became one of the most strategically important hosts of American power in Asia. A frontline state in every sense, and the same logic extended across the Pacific, where bases in Japan and Okinawa became central not just for regional defense, but for projecting force across vast distances, and every runway, port, and command center there carried a double meaning: peace on the surface, readiness underneath. And that duality became one of the defining features of America's overseas military presence, because the system was built to look stabilizing while always being prepared for sudden violence. And that made it both reassuring and deeply unsettling, depending on which side of the map you stood on. And as the decades passed, the ring became more sophisticated, more technologically advanced, and more deeply embedded in alliance structures, with intelligence sharing, joint exercises, missile defense systems, and integrated planning, all strengthening the sense that the base network was not just American property overseas, but the backbone of a wider military order. And yet, for all its strategic brilliance, the system carried a permanent risk, because surrounding your rivals may deter them, but it can also provoke them. And throughout the Cold War, both Moscow and Beijing viewed many of these bases not as neutral shields, but as threatening forward positions, signs that the United States was not merely defending space, but preparing to dominate it. And that fear fed arms races, hardened paranoia, and pushed rival powers to build their own military responses. Airfields linked to naval ports linked to logistics hubs linked to intelligence sites, and all of it tied together by communications, treaties, planning staffs, and a bureaucracy large enough to manage military presence across half the globe, and by the late 1940s, the system was no longer accidental to airfields, airfields linked to naval ports linked to logistics hubs linked to intelligence sites, and all of it tied together by communications, treaties, planning staffs, and a bureaucracy large enough to manage military presence across half the globe, and by the late 1940s, the system was no longer accidental, it was deliberate. And then came another turning point that made the expansion even more dramatic, the creation of formal alliances, because one thing, meaning the very structure built to prevent war, also helped keep the world in a constant state of readiness for one. And that is one of the great tensions at the heart of the story, America's base architecture of peace. But it was a peace built with runways pointed at possible battlefields, ports ready for escalation, and command centers prepared for the unthinkable. And once such a system exists, it creates its own momentum, because every new threat justifies another expansion. Every new expansion creates another tension. And every tension becomes proof that the system must remain. And by the height of the Cold War, that logic had become almost self-sustaining, driving America to maintain hundreds of sites abroad in what increasingly looked less like temporary defense and more like a permanent military geography, one that reached so deeply into the daily life of the planet that entire generations grew up under its shadow without ever fully seeing the scale of it. And yet even then, the network was still evolving, because, as the next chapter will reveal, the end of the Cold War did not end the base system. It gave it a new life, a new language, and a new set of enemies that would keep the machine running long after the old ideological map had collapsed. When the Cold War finally began to crack and the Soviet Union moved toward collapse, many people across the world expected something enormous to happen. They expected America's military machine to shrink, its overseas bases to close, and its global posture to soften, because after all, if the great rival was falling apart, what was the justification for keeping such a massive forward presence alive? And for a brief moment, it truly seemed possible that history might reverse itself, that the giant network, built across decades of fear and rivalry, would slowly unwind base by base, treaty by treaty, troop by troop. But that is not what happened. And what followed was one of the most revealing moments in the whole story, because instead of disappearing, the American base system adapted, and in adapting it proved something remarkable and deeply unsettling. It had grown beyond the enemy that created it. It no longer depended only on the Soviet threat. It had become a permanent instrument of American power in its own right, capable of surviving the death of the very world that had justified its rise. And this was not merely strategic flexibility. It was transformation, because Washington quickly replaced one argument with another, one map of danger with another, and one set of enemies with another. And in doing so, it preserved the basic logic that had guided its military footprint for decades. America still needed to be forward, still needed to be ready, still needed to be everywhere that instability, conflict, or strategic competition might emerge. And once that logic was accepted, the base network could survive almost any geopolitical change. Because if the Soviet Union was gone, there were still rogue states, regional wars, collapsing governments, terrorism, energy routes, rising powers, humanitarian crises, and new forms of conflict that could all be used to justify continued military presence abroad. And that is exactly what happened in the 1990s, a decade often remembered as a peaceful transition, but in reality filled with military recalibration, where America closed some large Cold War-era installations while expanding access, influence, and operational reach in new ways. And this was where the network became more agile, more modular, and in some ways, more difficult to see clearly, because not every base now had to look like a giant Cold War fortress. Some could be smaller, more specialized, more temporary in name, but highly functional in practice. And that made the whole system more politically survivable, because a lighter footprint often attracts less resistance while still preserving strategic advantage. And this shift became especially important in the Middle East, a region whose importance to American planners grew dramatically as oil, regional wars, and unstable alliances made it central to post-Cold War strategy. And the Gulf War in the early 1990s became another turning point, because it showed once again how valuable overseas infrastructure was to rapid military action. And after that war, America deepened its presence across the region through air access, logistics hubs, naval facilities, and partnerships that would become even more consequential in the years ahead. And then came the event that changed everything once again, the attacks of September 11th. And with them, the American base system entered a new age, one shaped not by a superpower standoff, but by the global war on terror. And suddenly the map of military necessity expanded in all directions: Central Asia, the Horn of Africa, the Gulf, South Asia, Eastern Europe, and beyond. And bases once again became the silent foundation beneath military campaigns, drone operations, intelligence missions, special forces deployments, detention systems, and counter-terror operations that stretched across continents. And what made this era so different was its fluidity. The enemy was no longer one state with one capital and one army. It was networks, cells, insurgencies, militants, safe havens, and shadowy threats that could appear almost anywhere. And to fight such enemies, America argued that it too had to be almost everywhere, or at least close enough to act at speed. And so the old empire of bases entered a new chapter, one built less on static front lines and more on flexible reach. But the deeper pattern remained exactly the same. Fear created justification. Justification created presence, and presence became permanent faster than the public often realized. And by now the network had become so normal to American strategy that many policymakers no longer even debated its existence, only its efficiency, its cost, and its configuration. And that is perhaps the most astonishing part of the story. What began in imperial expansion, hardened in World War, and spread through Cold War containment had by the early 21st century become a standing assumption of American power, almost like gravity, rarely questioned at its root, always ready to be adjusted. And yet, as this machine stretched into the modern age, another challenge was quietly rising, not from a collapsing state or hidden cell, but from the return of great power competition itself. And in the shadows of that return, the old logic of encirclement, readiness, and global positioning was beginning to awaken once more. And just when many believed the age of giant rivalries had faded into history, the map began to darken again, not with one single enemy, but with the return of powerful states determined to challenge the order America had built. And suddenly the old language of deterrence, strategic competition, and forward presence came roaring back with new urgency. Because while the global war on terror had stretched the American military footprint across deserts, mountains, and remote outposts, the deeper structure of the base network was now being pulled back toward an older and more dangerous purpose, preparing for the possibility of conflict with nations that could actually contest American power on land, at sea, in the air, in cyberspace, and even in space itself. And this is where the story enters its most modern and perhaps most suspenseful chapter, because today America's overseas bases are no longer simply remnants of old wars or launch pads for anti-terror missions. They are central pieces in a new era of strategic rivalry, especially in relation to China and Russia. And that has made the global footprint not smaller, but in many ways more valuable than ever, because a base in the modern age is not only a place for soldiers to sleep or aircraft to land, it is a node in a vast system of intelligence, missile defense, logistics, communications, cyber coordination, surveillance, and power projection. And the countries that host the highest concentration of American personnel abroad, especially Japan and Germany, are not historical accidents. They are living proof that the old architecture of post-war dominance still matters profoundly in the present, because from those locations, the United States can reinforce Europe, watch the Indo-Pacific, support naval operations, move aircraft quickly, and signal commitment to allies in ways that speeches alone never can, and that is why these bases remain so politically and strategically sensitive. Because they are not simply leftovers, they are frontline instruments in the struggle over who gets to shape the future balance of power. And nowhere is this tension more intense than in the Indo-Pacific, where the rise of China has forced American planners to think again in terms of distance, choke points, island chains, and rapid deployment, almost like an echo of earlier eras, but with much higher stakes, because this time the rival is not a weak state or insurgent movement, but a global power with enormous economic reach, advanced military capabilities, and growing ambition. And in response, the United States has leaned heavily on the very system it spent generations building, strengthening alliances, rotating forces, modernizing facilities, dispersing assets, and preparing for scenarios that would have once sounded unthinkable to the wider public. And all of this reveals the central truth of the entire story. America did not build bases around the world simply to fight the wars of the past. It built them to remain ready for the wars of the future, even the ones no one could fully predict. And that is why the network has endured for so long, because its greatest value is not only in what it does today, but in what it allows tomorrow. The ability to move first, respond faster, reassure allies, deter rivals, and preserve influence in a world where speed and position can matter as much as raw firepower. And yet, for all its strength, the system also faces growing pressure, because overseas bases are expensive, politically controversial, technologically vulnerable, and increasingly exposed to new forms of attack, from precision missiles to cyber disruption to drone warfare. Meaning the very fixed positions that once gave America unmatched reach can also become targets in a more dangerous age, and that is forced to quiet but serious debate inside military circles, not over whether the global base system should exist, but over how it must evolve to survive. And so the network continues to adapt, becoming more flexible in some places, more hardened in others, more distributed, more technologically connected, and more tightly woven into alliance structures than ever before. And through all these changes, one thing remains constant. America's global footprint is still one of the clearest expressions of its power, not because every base is large or famous, but because together they form a geography of presence unlike anything the modern world has ever seen, a silent map of concrete, steel, and strategic intention stretching across the planet. And when you finally step back and see the whole pattern, the real question becomes impossible to ignore. Was this network built to protect the world, to dominate it, or to make sure America would never again be too far away to decide what happens next? And that is the final twist in this story, because after everything, after the wars, the treaties, the occupations, the alliances, the speeches about peace, the warnings about enemies, the maps covered in red circles and sea lanes and missile ranges, the biggest mystery is not where America built its bases, but what those bases truly became. because by the year 2025, the United States no longer simply possessed a collection of military sites abroad. It possessed a living global structure, managed through the Department of Defense, coordinated across geographic combatant commands, supported by intelligence systems, diplomatic arrangements, logistics chains, industrial supply, and military doctrine so deeply embedded that it could continue operating even as presidents changed, parties changed, slogans changed, and entire eras of world politics rose and fell. And that is what makes this network so extraordinary and so difficult to fully grasp. It is not one base or 10 bases, or even one region. It is a worldwide mechanism of reach, a system that allows America to move power across the earth with a speed and familiarity that few empires in history ever achieved. And its defenders say that this is exactly why it must exist, because in their eyes the world is too unstable, too armed, too interconnected, and too dangerous for the United States to retreat behind its own shores. They argue that these bases protect trade routes, support allies, deter war, enable humanitarian response, discourage aggression, and preserve a balance of power that would otherwise collapse into chaos. And there is truth in that, because some of these installations have indeed helped prevent wider conflict, reassured vulnerable partners, and allowed rapid response in moments when hesitation might have cost thousands of lives. But there is another truth as well, one far less comfortable, because a network this vast does not only defend, it also influences, pressures, shapes, watches, and intervenes. And once a nation possesses the ability to appear almost anywhere with force, intelligence, and logistics already in place, the temptation to use that ability can become part of the system itself. And that is why critics around the world often describe the base network not merely as protection, but as a form of empire without classic colonies. A modern empire built not always through flags and governors, but through access rights, military agreements, strategic dependence, and permanent forward presence. And whether one sees that as security or domination often depends on where one stands, whether one lives under the shield or beneath the shadow, because for some countries, American bases symbolize reassurance, but for others, they symbolize unfinished occupation, constrained sovereignty, political imbalance, and the quiet reminder that major decisions about war and peace can still be shaped by a foreign military presence rooted in their own land. And this tension has never fully gone away. It has only changed form from generation to generation, from anti-communist necessity to anti-terror urgency, to great power competition in the modern age. And through every transformation, the network has survived because it keeps finding new reasons to exist, new threats to answer, new missions to absorb, and new language to justify what earlier generations might have recognized more clearly for what it was, a global architecture of power built slowly, carefully, and with extraordinary strategic patience, beginning in the age of imperial expansion, exploding after the Second World War, hardening through Cold War containment, adapting after the fall of the Soviet Union, and reshaping itself again for the tensions of the present. And that long evolution reveals the deepest truth of all. America did not build military bases around the world by accident. It built them because leaders in Washington came to believe that geography itself could be turned into advantage, that distance could be conquered with infrastructure, that influence could be anchored in concrete, and that if enough positions were secured across the map, then no crisis would ever again find the United States too far away, too slow, or too blind to respond. And in many ways, they succeeded beyond imagination, because the result is one of the largest and most sophisticated military footprints in human history. A system so normalized that much of the world barely notices it until a war breaks out. A protest erupts, or a crisis suddenly reveals just how much of modern power still depends on where the runways, ports, radar sites, and command rooms were planted decades earlier. And maybe that is the greatest suspense of all, not what has already happened, but what this machine means for the future. Because if another great conflict comes, if the fragile balance between major powers finally cracks, if one miscalculation in the Pacific, Europe, or the Middle East spirals faster than diplomacy can contain it, then many of the places we have spoken about tonight will not remain quiet names on a strategic map. They will become the front edge of history once again, and the world will discover, perhaps too late, that the global base network was never only about the past. It was always a wager on the future, a wager that America could shape events everywhere by never truly leaving anywhere. And whether that wager has kept the world safer or simply more tightly controlled is a question history is still trying to answer. Our channel is dedicated to uncovering the hidden stories, buried truths, and untold histories that shape the world we live in today. And before you go, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city and your country. And if you have not yet subscribed and liked the channel, please do so now because it truly helps more people discover stories like this. And if you would like to support our work even further, please consider joining our membership platform because that support goes a very long way in helping our team continue the rigorous research we carry out to bring you powerful stories like this one.